Tonight, we're going to talk about a man who was born with absolutely nothing, in a place most of the world had never heard of, and who by the end of his life had built the largest connected land empire in all of recorded human history. A quarter of the Earth's surface. That is not a poetic exaggeration meant to hook you before bed. That is genuinely what happened, and the fact that it happened inside a single human lifetime is one of the strangest and most compelling stories the past has ever produced. If you are new here, welcome in. Settle yourself. Pull the blankets up a little higher. This channel exists for the people who want to fall asleep learning something real, something that stays with them past the dream. And if that is you, then you are exactly where you belong tonight. Take a moment before we begin to like the video, subscribe if you have not yet, and drop your location and the local time in the comments below. There are people from every continent settling into the same story right now, in the same quiet dark, and knowing that always makes the room feel a little warmer somehow. So loosen your shoulders. Let your breathing slow down. Let the weight of the day begin to lift out of your body. We are travelling tonight to the eastern edge of Central Asia, roughly 800 years back through time, to a landscape of wind, grass, and endurance. Let the story begin. Before the empire, before the campaigns, before there was anything a mapmaker would ever have thought to record, there was only the grass. Not the manicured grass that lines the borders of gardens or the edges of country lanes, but a vast unbroken ocean of it, rolling from the great forests of Siberia in the north down toward the deserts of Central Asia in the south, and from the mountain ranges of Manchuria in the east all the way west toward the fringes of the Islamic world. At the beating heart of this immense territory sat the Mongolian plateau, perched on average nearly a mile above sea level, wide open to winds that travelled hundreds of miles across flat ground without a single tree, hill, or building to slow them down. In the summer months, the steppe could bake beneath a sun that left the earth pale and cracked, the pastures brittle underfoot. In winter, the temperatures fell to such extremes that livestock could freeze standing upright overnight, and a family that lost its animals had almost nothing left to sustain itself until the spring. This was the land that shaped the people who lived on it, generation after generation, long before anyone in the wider world had any reason at all to pay them serious attention. For thousands of years, the peoples of the Mongolian plateau organized their lives around a single principle. Movement. They kept horses first and foremost, alongside cattle, sheep, and goats, and they followed the seasons across the steppe. Northward in the summer to reach the fresh green pastures, southward again in the winter to find whatever shelter the low valleys and folded hills could offer against the worst of the cold. They lived inside round, portable felt tents called gurs, dwellings which could be dismantled and reassembled in less than an hour by an experienced family. Everything a household owned had to be portable, because remaining in one place for too long meant exhausting the land beneath your feet. An exhausted land meant a dying herd, and a dying herd meant a family that would not survive the coming winter. Mobility on the steppe was not a lifestyle preference. It was, quite simply, the price of continuing to exist. This kind of life demanded a very particular kind of person. Children on the plateau learned to ride horses before they had properly mastered walking on flat ground. Boys were handed small bows almost as soon as they were strong enough to draw the string, and by the time a Mongol man reached adulthood, he had spent more hours in the saddle than most professional cavalry soldiers anywhere else in the world would accumulate in an entire military career. He could place an arrow into a moving target from the back of a galloping horse with a consistency that would have puzzled and quietly humbled trained archers from China, from Persia, and eventually from Europe. The steppe, in its patient and unforgiving way, had spent centuries producing exactly this kind of human being, without ever seeming to intend anything of the sort. But for all their skill and physical toughness, the Mongol peoples of the 12th century were deeply, stubbornly, and habitually divided among themselves. The plateau was shared and quarrelled over by dozens of competing clans and tribal confederacies. There were the Mongols themselves, but also the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Karatis, the Oirats, and many others besides. These were not simply neighbouring peoples going about their lives in peace. They were rivals who raided each other's herds, who abducted each other's women during weddings and migrations, and who nursed long-running blood feuds that passed carefully from one generation to the next, like inherited debts. There was no single ruler of the steppe. There had never been one within living memory. The very notion of a unified authority commanding all these competing tribes would have struck most people living on the Mongolian plateau in the middle of the 1100s as not merely improbable, but faintly absurd. What actually held these societies together was not government and not geography, but the clan. A man's deepest loyalty flowed first to his bloodkin, then outward to the wider tribe of which he was a part, and then, sometimes, to a powerful leader he had personally chosen to follow. But even that last kind of loyalty was conditional. If a leader died, or showed weakness, or simply had a run of bad luck that suggested the sky was no longer favouring him, his followers might quietly dissolve and reassemble around someone stronger. Power on the steppe was a personal thing. It lived inside the man who held it, and inside the web of human relationships he was able to maintain around himself. The moment that web began to fray, the power went with it, no matter how impressive the man had once appeared. Religion on the plateau was largely shamanic in character. The central belief was in Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a supreme heavenly force believed to govern the whole of the cosmos, and to bestow either fortune or misfortune upon the men and women moving below. Shamans, known as Bi, served as intermediaries between the living and the world of spirits, performing ceremonies to summon rain, to advise on the timing of a raid, to intercede in matters of sickness and death. Alongside this foundational belief, though, sat a strikingly open attitude toward other faiths. Nestorian Christianity had already worked its way quietly into some of the steppe tribes, particularly among the powerful Karates. Buddhism filtered in gradually from Tibet and from China further to the south. Islam was present along the western and southern edges of the steppe world, and the Mongols held all of these ideas with what almost looks like ease, absorbing outside spiritual traditions without much conflict or anxiety, a flexibility of mind that would later prove to be one of their most effective tools once they became an empire rather than a scattered collection of clans. To the south of the plateau lay the most populous civilization on Earth at the time, but it was not a single unified state. The northern half of what we now call China was controlled by the Jin dynasty, established by the Jurchen people, who had swept down from Manchuria in the early 1100s and pushed the ethnic Han Chinese ruling class further southward. The southern Song dynasty held the regions below the Huai River, entirely separate in politics and identity, and between the tribes of the Mongolian steppe and the Jin heartland sat the Tangut kingdom of Shishir, occupying the northwestern corridor. These were agricultural, literate, densely populated societies sitting on enormous accumulated wealth, and they tended to look at the nomads to their north with a mixture of mild contempt and genuine, if quietly held, unease. For generations, the Jin dynasty and its predecessors had managed the northern steppe tribes through a strategy that had a long and dependable pedigree in international relations, a combination of selective trade privileges, occasional gifts of silk and grain, and the deliberate, careful encouragement of intertribal rivalry. Keep the tribes fighting each other, the reasoning went, and they will never have the time or the unity required to threaten China itself. It was a sensible policy, and it worked reasonably well for a very long time. The Jin in particular used the Tatars as a counterweight against the Mongols, quietly supplying them with resources so that the northern frontier would remain turbulent and pleasantly divided. It is worth noting in passing that this strategy, funding one group of people you dislike in order to harass another group of people you also dislike, has a very long and not particularly proud history in international affairs, and the Jin were far from the last to attempt it. What the planners in the Jin court did not perhaps fully consider was that every cycle of raiding, every generation of feud, every collapse and rebuilding of steppe alliance was also an education. The men who survived and rose on the Mongolian plateau were not simply hardened fighters. They were strategists, negotiators, and managers of small but ferociously competitive political systems. They understood how coalitions formed and how they collapsed. They understood the value of timing, of patience, and of a betrayal placed at exactly the right moment. These were people who had spent their entire lives operating inside conditions of near total uncertainty, where personal stakes were always extraordinarily high. The steppe produced hard men, yes, but it also produced deeply thoughtful ones, and somewhere in that long conditioning, a boy was about to be born who would take everything the plateau had taught his people and apply it on a scale nobody had ever imagined possible. Somewhere in the middle of the 12th century, and historians generally settle around the year 1162, though the exact date remains a matter of quiet academic dispute, a boy was born into the Borjigin clan of the Mongol tribe. His father was a man named Yeske, a minor chieftain, not a great Khan by any measure, but a capable raider and a recognized figure within his corner of the plateau. His mother was called Holan, and she had been taken from her first husband, a Merkit tribesman, during her wedding journey, folded through violence and circumstance into Yeske's household. This kind of abduction was, by the standards of the steppe, common enough that it did not carry any special mark of scandal. It was simply how certain marriages happened. The boy was born, according to the stories later told about him, gripping a dark clot of blood in his right hand. The people around him took this as a sign of something, though they could not quite say what. They named him Temjin, after a Tatar chieftain his father had recently captured in a raid, a naming custom that turned an infant into a small living trophy commemorating an enemy's defeat. It was not by any reasonable measure a spectacular beginning. A minor clan boy, born into a fractured and violent world, named for a captured foe as a kind of family memento. There was nothing at all in those first months, nothing that anyone standing outside the felt walls of the Jur could have pointed to, that would have suggested this particular child would one day cause the grass of half a continent to tremble beneath the weight of the largest land empire the world had ever seen. But history, as it so often does, had already made up its own mind about what came next. Temjin's early childhood, for the first several years of his life, was relatively unremarkable by the standards of the Mongolian steppe. His father, Yeske, moved the family with the seasons, as all steppe families did, maintaining their herd, tending to their gear, and navigating the constant low-level politics of clan life. Temjin grew up alongside his brothers, Kasar, Kakian, and Temge, and a younger sister named Temlin. There were also two half-brothers from one of Yeske's other wives, a young man named Bekta and another named Belguti. Households on the steppe were often structured this way, with multiple wives and children from different mothers all living and travelling together beneath the umbrella of a single clan. The world that Temjin grew up in was not peaceful, but it did have a certain rough, weathered predictability to it. Raids came and went, alliances shifted, seasons turned. A boy learned early what mattered: the health of the herd, the loyalty of his kin, the strength of his bow arm, and the ability to read which direction the wind of power was blowing on any given day. These were not abstract lessons drawn from books. They were lessons pulled directly out of watching, listening, and surviving. When Temjin was around 9 years old, Yeske made a decision that was entirely normal within steppe custom, but which would end up bending the whole future of his family into a completely different shape. He took his eldest son on a journey to find a bride. Marriage on the plateau typically involved locating a girl from a different clan, since marrying within your own bloodline was strongly discouraged, and ideally from a clan with useful connections or a good reputation. The two of them travelled to the territory of the Ongirat people, a group known, among other things, for producing particularly capable and intelligent women. There Yeske encountered a man named Day-Second, whose young daughter, Berte, had, according to the account preserved later in the secret history of the Mongols, a face that was bright with light and eyes that carried fire in them. Yeske was satisfied. An agreement was reached. Temjin, aged 9, was left with Day-Second's family to begin the customary period of living with his future in-laws before the formal marriage would eventually take place. It was all completely ordinary. Everything about it followed the standard rhythms of steppe life. Yeske began his journey home alone. On his way back across the plateau, he stopped to accept hospitality from a group of Tatars, the same people who had long been rivals and occasional enemies of the Borjigin Mongols. Whether they recognized him at once or only realized who he was after he had already eaten and drunk with them is not entirely clear from the accounts that survive. What is clear is that by the time he left their camp and continued his journey westward, he was already sick. The Tatars had almost certainly poisoned his food or his drink. This was not an uncommon method for dealing with an enemy on the steppe, where a direct confrontation could be costly, and an indirect one left considerably fewer loose ends dangling in the wind. Yeske managed to make it back close enough to his own people to send a messenger ahead, calling for a trusted man named Monglik to go and fetch Temujin from the Ongirat. By the time Temujin returned to his family's camp, his father was already dying. Within days, Yeske was dead. He was probably somewhere in his 30s. Temujin was 9, perhaps just barely 10. What followed was a study in how quickly loyalty could evaporate on the steppe. The clan, the very people who had looked to Yeske for leadership, who had raided beside him and shared meat at his fire, now looked at his widow and her young children and did a rapid piece of arithmetic in their heads. The children were too young to lead. Holen was a woman without a powerful male protector to speak for her. Following her family offered no advantage, and the steppe was not a place where loyalty survived long without practical benefit attached to it somewhere. One by one, and then in whole groups, the families and followers who had gathered around Yeske simply packed up and left. They took their animals with them. They took their possessions. They followed another leader, a man named Targatai, who was also of the Borjigin line, but who had no interest whatsoever in burdening himself with a dead man's difficult inheritance. Holen did not accept this quietly. She rode after the departing families, holding up the family's standard, the tuk, a pole hung with black horsehair, and calling out to them, appealing to their sense of obligation, to their honour, to whatever remaining thread of duty she could name. Some of the accounts suggest she managed to turn a few of them briefly back, but ultimately the departures continued, and the family was left more or less alone. A widow, 5 young children, and 2 half-brothers camped beside the Onon River, with no herd, no allies, and no safety net of any kind whatsoever. For the next several years this small remnant survived on almost nothing. Holen gathered wild plants, roots and berries along the riverbanks. The older children fished in the shallows. Temujin and his brothers learned to hunt the small animals of the steppe, marmots and rabbits, and the occasional deer, with whatever crude bows and snares they could put together for themselves. They were not starving in a dramatic, cinematic sense, but they were living at the absolute edge of what the steppe could offer to a family, without a functioning herd, without trade relationships, and without the protection of a recognized clan structure. These years did something to Temujin that is worth pausing on, because it will show up in almost everything he does later. The experience of being abandoned, of watching loyalty dissolve the very moment it became inconvenient, left him with an unusually clear-eyed understanding of what actually held people together and what did not. Blood alone was not enough. Tradition alone was not enough. What kept people loyal was a combination of genuine personal bond, shared interest, and the belief that following a particular leader actually led somewhere worth going. He had seen the alternative up close, in the very shape of his mother's back, as she rode after the departing families with the family standard raised, calling for people who had already made their decisions. It had cost his family very nearly everything they had, and he did not forget the shape of that lesson. There was also a harder, more troubling lesson from those years beside the Onon River, one that says something uncomfortable about the kind of man Temujin was becoming. Inside the family itself, tension gradually developed over food, which is always a serious matter when food is genuinely scarce, and over questions of precedence and leadership between Temujin and his older half-brother Bekta. The exact details have been filtered through centuries of accounts that are not always neutral in their sympathies, but the core of what happened is not disputed. Temujin and his younger brother Kasar hunted down Bekta one afternoon and killed him. Their mother Holan, when she learned of it, was furious. She called her sons out by name with a rage that the secret history records in considerable detail, comparing them to animals that devoured their own kind. It was a brutal act, and it has troubled historians and readers of Mongol history ever since. Some have framed it in coldly practical terms as an act of desperate resource competition inside a family living on the edge of survival, where eliminating a rival for food and authority was, in ugly language, a rational decision. Others have read it as an early sign of the kind of ruthless calculation that would define Temujin's later career. The understanding that a challenge to his leadership, even inside his own family, could not simply be managed or endured, but had to be resolved conclusively. He was perhaps 12 years old at the time, possibly 13. The steppe had already taught him things that most people, in most places on Earth, never have to learn at all. The years beside the Onon also gave Temujin something less grim to carry with him: his first genuine friendship and his first genuine alliance. Among the boys he encountered during those cold, hungry seasons was a young man from a nearby Jadaran clan named Jamuka. The two of them exchanged the traditional tokens of Mongolian childhood friendship, small ankle bones from sheep, and declared themselves Anda, sworn brothers. It was a bond that the steppe took seriously, a pledge of loyalty that was meant to run deeper than ordinary clan obligation, deeper even than shared blood. Jamuka was clever, charismatic and ambitious in his own quiet way, and the friendship between the two boys would eventually grow into one of the most consequential and, in the end, one of the most tragic relationships in the entire story of the Mongol rise to power. But that was still far ahead of them. For now, Temujin was simply a boy without a clan, without land, without animals, camped beside a slow river in one of the emptiest landscapes anywhere on Earth, learning the specific kind of patience that only comes from having very little and choosing to wait anyway. What kept the family from complete collapse during those long, thin years beside the Onon was, more than anything else, Holan herself. She was, by any fair accounting, a remarkable woman. She had been abducted from her first husband on her wedding journey, folded into Yeske's household, built a life around him and their children, and then watched that life dissolve almost overnight when the clan turned its back and rode away. She managed the family's survival with a steadiness that even the later Mongol records, which were not always inclined to focus on women, acknowledged clearly and repeatedly. She knew which roots and plants along the riverbank were edible and which were not. She rationed food with a precision born of experience and necessity. She held the family's sense of itself together through the worst of it, which was perhaps the most difficult task of all, keeping 5 grieving, hungry, increasingly wild children from losing their sense of who they were and what they might still become. The Onon River Valley, where the family sheltered, was at least not a terrible place to survive on subsistence terms. The river provided fish, the surrounding land offered game. The forests nearby yielded firewood and some measure of protection from the worst of the winter winds. They did not thrive by any reasonable measure, but they endured, season after season, developing skills and a kind of collective family toughness that formal training could never quite replicate. By the time Temujin reached his mid-teens, he was an experienced hunter, a capable horseman despite having access to very few horses of his own, and a young man who had already spent years thinking, very carefully, about what had gone wrong with his father's position, and about how such a collapse might be prevented from happening again in his own life. The answer he was beginning to form, even then, had something to do with the nature of loyalty itself, and with building bonds that would go deeper than the conditional clan ties which had dissolved so quickly around his mother. He could not have put it into words yet, but the seed of it was there, planted in those hard years beside the river, watered by everything the steppe had taken from him. The relative quiet of the Onon River years came to a sharp end when Temujin was somewhere around 14 or 15 years old. The Taishiud clan, the same group that had abandoned Holan and her children after Yeske's death, still led by that same Targetai, had been watching the surviving family from a comfortable distance for several years. Targetai was not a man who forgot old rivalries or left loose ends to develop at their own pace. Temujin was growing, and a growing Borjigin boy with even a small reputation for toughness was the kind of thing a rival clan leader on the steppe strongly preferred to deal with before it became a larger problem later on. The Taichiud raided the family's camp and took Temujin prisoner. He was not killed on the spot, which was itself telling. Killing a captive outright was not always the preferred solution. A living prisoner could be put to work, displayed as a symbol of dominance, or used as a piece in some later political trade. Instead, Temujin was fitted with a kange, a wide wooden collar that locked around his neck and prevented the wearer from feeding himself, from lying down comfortably, or from doing much of anything at all without assistance or permission from someone else. It was a deliberately humiliating device designed to reduce a person to a state of visible, public helplessness. Targetai moved his captive from family to family within the Taichiud group, which served both as a method of sharing the daily burden of guarding him and as a way of demonstrating his personal control over a Borjigin rival to the wider community. What happened next is one of the most retold stories in the early Mongol accounts, and while the specific details have clearly been shaped and polished by generations of later storytelling, the core of the event appears to be genuine. During a festival gathering of the Taichiud, when the guards were somewhat relaxed and attention was scattered by drink and celebration, Temujin managed to break free. Exactly how is described a little differently depending on which source you consult, but the most common version involves him using the kang itself as a weapon against a guard before slipping away into the river. He hid in the water, submerged up to his nose, and stayed there long enough for the initial search parties to pass over him without noticing. A man from one of the Taichiud families, a person named Sorkin Shira, spotted him hiding in the shallows and chose, for reasons that were either compassionate, quietly political, or perhaps some private combination of both, not to raise the alarm. Later that same night, Sorkin Shira's own family helped Temujin remove the Congo, hid him briefly inside a cart full of wool, and eventually helped him escape back to his own people. It was the kind of small, individual act of quiet loyalty, performed at real personal risk, that Temujin remembered clearly and repaid many years later when he had the power to do so. He was not, as his life would demonstrate again and again, a person who forgot help when it had been given to him in a moment of genuine need. He returned to his family beside the Onon and resumed the slow, difficult work of building a life from almost nothing. The escape itself added something to his reputation on the steppe. The story of a young man who had slipped out of a Taichiud kange and vanished into a river was exactly the kind of tale that travelled quickly from camp to camp. But reputation alone did not feed anyone or replace a lost herd. What Temujin needed next was connection, alliance, some foothold, however modest, in the wider world of steppe politics. The first step in that direction was, on the surface, a personal one. Temujin travelled back to the Ongirat people to claim Berte, the girl his father had arranged for him years earlier. The family had honoured the original agreement. She had waited. The bond had held. Bertie came with a significant gift, a magnificent black sable coat that her family had kept carefully as part of the marriage arrangement. This coat would shortly prove more useful than anyone standing in the Ongirat camp that day could possibly have anticipated. Temujin brought Bertie back to his family's camp, and for a brief, hopeful period, things seemed at last to be stabilising. But the steppe does not offer long stretches of calm to people without strong protective alliances, and disaster arrived very quickly. The Merkits, the same tribe from which Yeske had once taken Holan on her original wedding journey, had never forgotten the insult. Blood debts on the Mongolian plateau were not abstractions or metaphors. They were obligations passed carefully from father to son, held in reserve until the right moment arrived, and the Merkits had been waiting for years for exactly this kind of opportunity to balance the account. One morning before dawn, a large Merkit raiding party swept through the camp. Temujin, warned just barely in time by a family member who heard the approaching horses, escaped up into the surrounding hills. Brute did not make it out. She was taken. The loss of Brute was not simply a personal blow, though it was certainly that as well. On the steppe, a man who could not protect his own household commanded no respect, attracted no followers, and could expect no political future of any kind. Recovering Brute was not merely a matter of marriage. It was a matter of political survival. And recovering her on his own, with no herd, no warriors, and no clan behind him, was not remotely possible. What Temujin did next demonstrated for the first time clearly and publicly how his mind actually worked in political terms. He went looking for powerful friends. His father Yesuke had years earlier maintained a bond of sworn brotherhood, an Anda relationship with Togrul, the Khan of the Kereid people, one of the largest and most powerful tribal confederacies on the entire steppe based around the Upper Tool River. This old connection gave Temujin a legitimate reason to approach Togrul directly, and he took full advantage of it. He presented the black sable coat, the gift that Brute's family had given, as a formal offering to Togrul, and asked, in the proper language of steppe diplomacy, for help in recovering his wife. Togrul accepted both the gift and the appeal. He pledged warriors. Temujin also reached out to Jamuka, his childhood Anda, his sworn brother from those years beside the Onon. Jamuka had grown into exactly the kind of person his early promise had suggested. A capable, charismatic leader who had built a reasonable following of his own in the intervening years. He agreed to ride with Temujin as well. The combined force struck the Merkit camps in a swift, well-coordinated night raid. The Merkits scattered. Bertie was recovered, frightened but alive, and reunited with Temujin in the immediate aftermath of the fighting. The campaign was not especially large by the standards of what would come later. It was a tribal recovery raid, not a conquest in any meaningful sense. But it mattered enormously for what it demonstrated to everyone watching. Temujin had identified the right allies, made the right appeals, offered the right gifts, organised the right action at the right time, and he had gotten his wife back when getting her back had seemed almost impossible. That kind of outcome on the steppe meant something. It meant a great deal. Bertie was, by the time she was recovered, visibly pregnant. The child she carried, a boy who would eventually be given the name Jochi, had been conceived during the weeks she had spent among the Merkits. Temujin acknowledged Jochi as his son without any public ambiguity, and Jochi was raised alongside his other children as an equal member of the family. But the question of Jochi's paternity floated quietly through Mongol court politics for the rest of his life, and would eventually play a significant role in the fractures of the later empire. Temujin never addressed the matter directly, which was itself a kind of statement. On the steppe, what a powerful man chose not to say carried as much weight as what he chose to say plainly out loud. After the Merkit campaign, Temujin and Jamuka spent roughly a year and a half travelling and living together, a period that the Mongol accounts describe in terms suggesting a genuinely close friendship between two equally ambitious young men. They shared a single tent, they exchanged further gifts, they talked, presumably late into many nights, about leadership and about the nature of loyalty and about the way power actually worked on the steppe. And each of them, without quite realising it, was beginning to answer those questions in a slightly different way than the other one was. By any honest measure, Jamuka was Temujin's intellectual equal, and possibly his superior as a natural politician working within the older, clan-based model of steppe leadership. He understood the traditional rules of that system deeply, and he played by them with real skill and evident enjoyment. But the two men were not, in the end, actually the same, and the differences between them, which might have seemed minor and easily bridgeable during the warm summer months of shared travel and shared meals, began to matter a great deal more once each of them started attracting followers of his own in serious numbers. Jamuka's approach to leadership followed the traditional steppe pattern very closely. Strong men at the top of the arrangement, weaker clients arranged carefully below them, the whole hierarchy maintained through the social categories that clan and lineage had always defined. It was familiar. It was legible to everyone. It required no explanation. Temujin was doing something quietly different, almost without announcing that he was doing it at all. He was drawing followers based on personal loyalty to him directly, rather than through the intermediary of clan structure. He was rewarding capable men regardless of the accident of their birth. He was keeping his word to those who kept theirs to him, and he was positioning himself, gradually and without much fanfare, not as the best man operating within the old system, but as an alternative to that whole system altogether. The split between the two of them, when it finally came, was quiet rather than sudden. There was a night camp during which Jamuka made a small, casual remark about where different groups within their travelling party should pitch their tents, a comment that Brute, listening with the careful attention of someone who had learnt to read power very precisely, interpreted as a subtle signal of diminishing respect toward her husband. The two men parted ways not long after. There was no confrontation, no declared breach of friendship. Temujin simply began riding in a different direction, and some of the people travelling with them chose to follow him rather than Jamuka. Some of those who followed him were not previously committed to either man. They were warriors and families who had been watching very carefully throughout those months of shared travel, weighing the two personalities against each other, and had decided after prolonged and quiet observation that Temujin was the one worth betting a future on. Each new follower made him slightly more credible to the next potential follower. Each gift he distributed, each promise he kept, each fair decision he handed down in a dispute added quietly to a growing sense out on the steppe that something new was taking shape here. He was still, in absolute terms, very far from powerful, but the long climb had genuinely begun, and the direction of it was becoming visible to anyone who cared enough to look. The decade and a half that followed the split from Jamuka was not a smooth, unbroken rise toward greatness. It was a grinding, stop-and-start process of campaign, alliance, setback and recovery, the kind of long political work that tends to get compressed dramatically in the retelling, but actually consumed years of effort and real personal danger at almost every turn. Temujin was building something without any reliable template for what he was building, and the steppe pushed back consistently. His early following was small, but it was unusually cohesive. The men who attached themselves to him during those first years tended to stay attached to him, which was itself notable in a world where switching loyalties was entirely normal and barely worth remarking on when it happened. Part of this had to do with how he treated the people who served him. Captured enemies who submitted and swore loyalty were folded into his ranks rather than enslaved or killed outright. Skilled men were given positions that reflected their demonstrated ability rather than their birth clan. Defeated rivals who offered genuine submission were, more often than not, spared and quietly incorporated into the growing enterprise. This last point was genuinely unusual on the Mongolian steppe, where the traditional response to a defeated enemy was something considerably less generous, and word of it began to spread quickly. His first major organised military actions during this period were against the Jurkin clan, a Borjigin subgroup that had failed to arrive as promised during an earlier campaign against the Tatars, an offence which Temujin treated as a fundamental breach of the loyalty compact he was slowly attempting to establish as a non-negotiable standard. He defeated them, killed their leaders, and absorbed their people. Then he turned toward the Tatars themselves, the tribe responsible all those years earlier for poisoning his father, Yeske. The campaign against the Tatars was fought in alliance with the Jin dynasty and with Togrul of the Keriids, and it was successful. Afterward, Temujin made a decision that illustrated in a single stroke both his ruthlessness and his particular system of thinking. He ordered the execution of every Tatar man who stood taller than the height of a wagon wheel. Children below that height were spared and distributed among Mongol families to be raised as Mongols. The logic was, in its cold way, straightforward. Adults had identity, resentment, memory, and the capacity for organised revenge that could return years later. Children could be remade. It was a chilling calculation, and he made it without any apparent hesitation. Around the year 1187, a significant military confrontation with Jamuka took place at a location remembered in the sources as Dalan Baljut. The two former sworn brothers faced each other with their respective followings for the first time, as genuine opponents rather than as friends who had drifted apart. Jamuka won that particular battle, and he did something in the aftermath which damaged his reputation considerably among the broader steppe population that had been watching from the sidelines. He boiled captured officers alive in enormous cooking pots. By the already harsh standards of steppe warfare, this was widely seen as excessive, even cruel in a way that pushed beyond acceptable military violence into something uglier. Temujin, by contrast, had been steadily developing a reputation for more measured, more calculated treatment of defeated enemies. The contrast between the two men was not lost on the people watching from the edges of the conflict, and it slowly, quietly began to shift opinion in favour of the man who had technically lost the battle. Over the following years, Temujin continued absorbing tribes into his growing coalition. The Tatars more fully, elements of the Merkits again, smaller clans that read the direction the wind was blowing and chose to join rather than resist. His relationship with Togrul deepened and then, inevitably, began to crack. Togrul was a useful ally, but he was an anxious one. Increasingly aware that the younger man he had helped years earlier was now the dominant force on the eastern steppe rather than a junior partner requiring guidance. Togrul's son, Sengum, pushed his father steadily toward a confrontation, arguing, quite accurately, that if Temujin continued expanding unchecked, the Kerid position would eventually become untenable. A plot to ambush Temujin at a staged wedding feast was leaked to him at the last possible moment, and he escaped it just barely in time. What followed was a hard military campaign during which Temujin initially suffered serious defeats, including one engagement in which he was struck in the neck by an arrow and spent the entire night on the field, while a loyal companion named Jelme sucked blood from the wound to keep him from choking to death on his own bleeding. He recovered. Togrul, after a series of reversals, was eventually driven off and killed by the Naimans, which solved one immediate problem for Temujin, and in doing so created another entirely. The Naimans were the last major independent power remaining on the steppe, a large, relatively sophisticated tribal confederacy occupying the western regions of Mongolia, whose ruler, Taiyan Khan, had become something of a collecting point for every rival and refugee that Temujin's expansion had displaced over the previous years. Jamuka was there, remnants of the Merkits were there, Kerid survivors were there. It was, in rough terms, a coalition of everyone who had good reason to want Temujin stopped, all gathered under a single leadership and given the chance, at last, to settle the whole matter decisively. The campaign against the Naimans, fought around the year 1204, was the largest military operation Temujin had conducted to that point in his career. He moved with an organised, disciplined force that used coordinated night marches to create the appearance of a much larger army through the wide, deliberate spread of its campfires across the darkened steppe. Taiyan Khan, watching from higher ground and seeing what looked like an enormous, endless advancing force, hesitated at exactly the wrong moment. His son, Kuklug, urged an immediate attack. Taiyan Khan pulled back instead, giving the initiative away before the battle had even properly begun. The resulting engagement went very badly for the Naimans. Taiyan Khan died in the fighting. Kuklug escaped westward and would eventually become a problem in his own right much later on. Jamuka, who had been present with the Naimans, slipped away yet again into the western steppe. The capture of Jamuka followed not long afterward, though it did not come through direct pursuit. His own men, understanding perfectly well which way things were now moving, seized him themselves and brought him inbound, hoping, presumably, that delivering the famous fugitive would earn them a good reception at Temujin's camp. Temujin had those men executed immediately for having betrayed their own leader. The loyalty compact he had built his entire following on worked in every direction, and he was not interested in setting a precedent that rewarded men who sold out the person they had once sworn to serve. It was a signal as much as it was a punishment, and everyone standing there watching understood it as both. Then he sat down alone with Jamuka. What passed between the two of them in those final private hours is not reliably recorded anywhere. What is recorded is that Jamuka refused an offer of renewed brotherhood and asked instead for a clean death, specifically one that did not involve the spilling of blood, which on the steppe carried spiritual significance for how a great man was to be sent out of the world. Temujin granted this. Jamuka was killed without any spilling of blood, likely through the breaking of his back, and he was buried afterward with the honours appropriate to a leader of his standing. It was, as endings between rivals go, unexpectedly dignified. The two men had been sworn brothers, then competitors, then enemies, and Temujin appears to have handled that final meeting with something more complicated and more heavy than simple triumph. They had known each other, in one form or another, for most of their lives. By the spring of 1206, the Mongolian plateau was unified under a single authority for the first time in its entire recorded history. Every major tribe had been defeated, incorporated, or driven from the steppe. Temujin called a great assembly, a Kurultai, on the banks of the Onon River, the same river where he had spent those cold, hungry years hiding in the water and hunting marmots to keep his family alive. The symbolism of that particular location was almost certainly not accidental. At the gathering, before an assembly of his followers and the leaders of every incorporated tribe on the plateau, Temujin was formally declared the supreme ruler of all the Mongol peoples. The title bestowed upon him that day was Genghis Khan. The precise meaning of the title has been debated by scholars for several centuries now. The most widely accepted interpretation is something close to universal ruler, or ruler of the ocean, with the ocean being understood metaphorically as the totality of the world. It is worth noting, purely as a minor historical footnote, that a group of academics spent a very long time arguing carefully about the exact meaning of a word which the man who received it then spent the rest of his life making entirely self-explanatory to everyone else on Earth. The Kurultai on the Onon was also the occasion for a series of foundational decisions about how the new Mongol nation would be organized going forward. A legal code known as the Great Yasa was developed, a set of laws covering everything from military conduct to the treatment of conquered peoples to basic standards of behavior expected within the community itself. The Yasa would be refined and expanded over time, but its core principles established from the very beginning that this new Mongol state was not simply a larger version of the old tribal system with a bigger man at the top. It was something genuinely different in kind. The army was reorganized along strict decimal lines, units of 10, of 100, of 1,000, and of 10,000 warriors, each with its own designated commander, each accountable upward through the chain in a way that had not previously existed on the steppe. Soldiers were assigned to their units without regard for their original clan or tribe of origin, which effectively broke the old social glue of tribal loyalty and replaced it with a new kind of loyalty. Loyalty to the unit, to the commander, and ultimately to Genghis Khan himself. A man who had been a Merkit only a few years earlier, or a Tatar or a Keryid, was now simply a Mongol soldier serving in a unit of 1,000, and his standing within that unit depended entirely on what he could do and what he had shown himself capable of, rather than where he had originally come from. Key commanders were elevated to positions of permanent authority. Men like Subutai, Jebe, Mukali, and Jelme were given commands that reflected their demonstrated ability rather than any inherited claim. These were not noble men in any hereditary sense. Subutai, who would go on to become arguably the most accomplished battlefield commander in the entire span of Mongol history, had been born a blacksmith's son somewhere on the steppe. Before the year 1206, that particular background would have capped his prospects fairly firmly at a certain level. Under the new arrangement Genghis Khan was building, it meant almost nothing at all. What Genghis Khan had assembled on the banks of the Onon River was not merely an empire in the early stages of expansion. It was a functioning state, with a written legal code, a professional military organised along entirely new lines, and a structure of governance that drew on human talent wherever it happened to find it. The world to the south, east and west of the plateau had at that moment absolutely no idea what had just been put together on the grass above them. They were about to find out. To understand what the Mongol army actually was, once it began moving beyond the steppe, it helps to set aside the image that tends to come immediately to mind when the subject arises. A horde of screaming riders pouring across the landscape in a disorganized mass of horses, dust and noise. That picture, which has been repeated in illustrations, paintings and films for centuries now, is almost entirely wrong in every meaningful respect. The Mongol military was one of the most disciplined, precisely coordinated and strategically sophisticated fighting forces that the medieval world ever produced anywhere. It did not succeed because it was large. It succeeded because it was better organized, better led, and better adapted to the specific conditions of its campaigns than almost anything it encountered along the way. The foundation of the entire system was the horse archer. Every Mongol soldier was a cavalryman, and every Mongol cavalryman had grown up on horseback from the earliest years of childhood. This was not training in any conventional military sense of the word. It was something considerably more deeply embedded than that. The relationship between a Mongol rider and his horse was the accumulated instinct of an entire lifetime, absorbed through the body long before it was ever articulated as technique. A soldier could eat in the saddle, sleep briefly in the saddle, and shoot with real accuracy from the saddle at full gallop, releasing the arrow at the precise instant between the horse's strides when all four hooves were momentarily off the ground and the animal's body was steady in the air. This technique, sometimes known as the Parthian shot when performed during a retreat, was practiced until it became reflex rather than any kind of conscious thought. The weapon that made all of this genuinely lethal was the Mongol composite bow. It was a short bow by the standards of the era, short enough to be used effectively from horseback, but its layered construction made it far more powerful than its modest size suggested to an untrained eye. Built from carefully laminated layers of horn, sinew and wood, the composite bow could store and release energy with an efficiency that other bows of the period simply could not approach. Its effective range was somewhere around 160 to 170 yards, and in skilled hands it could penetrate armour at distances that left the person wearing that armour feeling, in retrospect, rather underserved by his own equipment. The bow took years to construct properly and was sensitive to moisture, which is why Mongol soldiers kept their bow cases wrapped in waterproof coverings and carried multiple bows with them on any serious campaign. Losing your bow was, in Mongol military terms, roughly equivalent to a modern soldier losing his rifle and most of his ammunition simultaneously. Each Mongol soldier went to war with multiple horses, typically somewhere between 3 and 5 per man, which gave the army a logistical capacity that no other force of the entire era could remotely match. A tired horse was simply swapped for a fresh one, and the pace of advance could be maintained across distances that would have exhausted a European or Chinese cavalry force completely into uselessness. Mongol armies regularly covered distances in a matter of days that their opponents had assumed would take them weeks to travel. This speed was not accidental. It was a deliberate operational advantage, cultivated and maintained through constant, careful attention to the horse supply. The army divided its cavalry into 2 broad categories that worked together as a coordinated system. The light cavalry, the horse archers, would engage the enemy at range, circling, probing, drawing responses, and then retreating just fast enough to stay out of effective counter-range. The heavy cavalry, armed with lances and wearing leather or lamella armour, were held back deliberately until the moment was right for a decisive strike. The coordination between these two arms required disciplined communication and a shared understanding of the battle plan at every level of command, from the overall general down to the commander of a single unit of 10. The feigned retreat was the Mongol tactic that broke more enemy armies over the coming decades than perhaps any other single manoeuvre in their repertoire. A force of light cavalry would engage, appear to be gradually getting the worst of the encounter, and then, at what looked like exactly the right moment, would turn and flee across the ground. Enemy forces, particularly those from cultures that valued aggressive pursuit as a mark of battlefield virtue, would break formation almost automatically to chase them. The retreating Mongols would then pull the pursuing force over ground of their own careful choosing, stretching it out gradually, separating the fast riders from the slower ones, drawing the whole thing away from its supporting units. Then, when the pursuing force was sufficiently disordered and committed too deeply to withdraw safely, the heavy cavalry would appear suddenly from concealed positions on the flanks. The light cavalry would wheel and come charging back. The pursuit became a trap, and the trapped force found itself surrounded and attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, without any real hope of coherent response. Armies that understood this tactic in advance and tried to resist the urge to pursue still found it difficult to hold their formation steady against riders who could maintain a controlled retreat at high speed while continuing to fire arrows backward over the tails of their horses with disturbing accuracy. Before any major campaign, Genghis Khan invested serious time and resources in intelligence gathering. Mongol agents travelled far ahead of the army as merchants, as pilgrims, and as traders, gathering information about roads, water sources, fortifications, garrison sizes, political tensions inside the target state, and the loyalties of border populations that might be usefully turned. By the time the army itself actually began to move, its commanders typically knew more about the terrain and the political situation of the country they were about to enter than many of that country's own provincial governors did. This intelligence work was not glamorous, and it has received far less attention in the historical record than the battles themselves. But it was, arguably, just as important as anything that happened later on the field. Psychological operations were used with the same deliberate intention as cavalry maneuvers were. The Mongol approach to an enemy city typically followed a very clear sequence. Messengers were sent first, offering terms of surrender. If the city chose to submit at this stage, it was generally spared, required to provide supplies and tribute, and left otherwise largely intact. If it chose to resist, the city was warned again, quite explicitly, about what would follow if resistance continued. If it still resisted at that point, and was then taken by force, the destruction was comprehensive and intentional, not merely as punishment for the specific city in question, but as a deliberate message to every other city in the surrounding region about the practical cost of resistance. Word of what had happened to a city that refused to submit travelled ahead of the army faster than the army itself could physically move, and many subsequent cities opened their gates well before a single Mongol soldier had come within sight of their walls. Terror, in this sense, was a logistical tool. It reduced the number of sieges the army actually had to fight. Siege warfare was the one area where the steppe background offered no natural advantage whatsoever, and Genghis Khan handled this particular gap in his own capabilities the same way he handled most problems that came his way, which was by finding people who already knew how to do it and putting them straight to work. Chinese engineers, captured or actively recruited during the early campaigns against the Shishir and later the Jin dynasty, were incorporated directly into the Mongol army and given resources to build and operate the full range of siege equipment that settled civilizations had spent centuries developing. Trebuchets, battering rams, siege towers, systems for undermining walls from below. Persian and Central Asian specialists joined later as the empire expanded westward, bringing their own traditions of siegecraft with them. The Mongol army that attacked fortified cities during the middle years of its imperial expansion was, in effect, carrying with it a considerable working library of borrowed technical knowledge, operated by specialists drawn from half a dozen different cultures who might otherwise never have crossed paths in a single lifetime. The Imperial Guard, known as the Keshig, served a function that went well beyond simple personal protection of the Khan. It was simultaneously a bodyguard, an administrative corps, and a training ground for future commanders and administrators across the empire. Young men from every corner of the growing territory, including the sons of defeated enemies who had been recently incorporated, were brought into the Keshig, where they received direct daily exposure to how the Mongol state was actually governed, how campaigns were planned in advance, and how important decisions were made at the very highest level of command. Those who showed genuine ability moved outward from the Keshig into positions of command across the empire's various territories. It was, in effect, an officer school and a civil service academy combined into a single institution, and it produced a whole generation of administrators and generals who shared a common practical framework and a common personal loyalty to the centre of the enterprise. Women within the Mongol system held a position that would have surprised observers from most other contemporary cultures they encountered. While Mongol women did not typically serve in combat roles, they managed the logistical base of the whole society, the herds, the gers, the supply trains that moved with any campaign, with a degree of autonomous authority that was real rather than merely ceremonial. The wives of senior commanders, and of the great Khan himself, held recognized power within their own domains, could negotiate on behalf of their husbands during those long stretches when the men were away on campaign, and in some cases exercised direct political judgment on important matters that would have been unthinkable in the courts of many contemporary civilizations. Berti, throughout Genghis Khan's long career of campaigning, remained a trusted advisor whose opinions on matters of succession, marriage and alliance he took very seriously indeed. This was not incidental to the functioning of the empire. It was built directly into the structure of a society where the men spent extended periods away on campaign, and where the entire domestic and logistical operation had to continue functioning smoothly without them for months at a time. Communication across the battlefield itself was handled through flag signals and controlled smoke, with each unit maintaining its own established system of relay. Across the wider empire, a courier network called the Yam moved messages between commanders and administrators at speeds that were, for the medieval period, genuinely remarkable to observers from anywhere else in the world. Relay stations were set up at regular intervals across the steppe, each one carefully stocked with fresh horses ready to go. A message could travel from one end of the Mongol operational theatre to the other in a matter of days rather than weeks. This kept Genghis Khan informed and in effective control of campaigns that were sometimes unfolding simultaneously in completely different parts of the known world. A coordination challenge that would have broken most military systems of the era into fragments within a single season. What the Mongol war machine amounted to, taken as a complete whole, was a combined arms force built on speed, on intelligence, on psychological pressure, and on disciplined execution, all applied by men who had spent their entire lives developing exactly the physical and mental skills the system required from them. It was not invincible. It had real weaknesses, particularly in naval operations, and in densely forested or jungle terrain where its horses could not maneuver freely. But on the open steppe, on the wide plains of northern China, and across the broad agricultural heartlands of Central Asia, it was as close to genuinely unstoppable as anything the medieval world had ever produced. The army that rode south from the plateau in the years following 1206 was about to demonstrate exactly this to a world that had never really imagined such a thing was possible. The first target south of the steppe was not the powerful Jin dynasty. It was the Tangut kingdom of Shishir, the buffer state occupying the northwestern corridor between Mongolia and China proper. This was a deliberate strategic choice, not an accident of geography. Shishir was large enough to be worth conquering, and small enough to be manageable as a first major campaign against a settled walled civilization. It also sat directly across the main routes between Mongolia and the Jin heartland further east, which meant that leaving it unconquered while turning east first would have been a serious strategic error, opening the Mongol rear to potential intervention at exactly the wrong moment. Genghis Khan launched his first campaign into Shire territory around 1209, and the experience taught the Mongol army several important things it needed to learn before attempting anything larger. The Tangut people had built their kingdom over roughly 2 centuries across a difficult landscape of desert, mountain, and semi-arid plateau. Their capital, Zhongxing, sat on the Yellow River, surrounded by strong walls and defended by a garrison thoroughly accustomed to holding fortified positions against nomadic pressure. The Mongols, moving in from the north with their usual speed, could sweep across open country efficiently, but they ran into immediate and quite serious difficulty when they reached anything with walls around it. The first attempts to take fortified Tangut cities involved tactics carried over, largely unchanged from steppe raiding. Fast approaches, arrow fire, psychological pressure through visible threat. These worked poorly against stone and packed earth defences manned by disciplined defenders who had absolutely no reason to come outside their walls and fight in the open where they knew they would lose. The campaign against Zhongxing eventually involved one of the more creative, if ultimately unsuccessful, attempts at siege engineering in the entire early Mongol record. The Mongols diverted water from the Yellow River in an effort to flood the city's defences. The plan had a certain logical appeal on paper. Water where walls stood would tend to undermine both, but the actual execution went badly wrong. The improvised dikes failed at the worst possible moment. The flood spread in directions that had not been intended by anyone involved in the planning, and the Mongol camp itself ended up substantially inundated. It is the kind of story that historians tend to record with a slightly raised eyebrow, and the Mongol commanders involved presumably felt more or less the same way about it in real time. The city held. The campaign was eventually concluded not through direct assault, but through a negotiated submission. The Shishir ruler agreed to pay regular tribute, offer a daughter in marriage to Genghis Khan, and provide military support for any future Mongol operations that might require it. The formal conquest of Shishir would come later, and under considerably different circumstances. But for the moment, the campaign had accomplished more than enough. The corridor was open. The way east was clear. The turn toward the Jin dynasty came in 1211, and it was a campaign of an entirely different scale and character. The Jin ruled northern China, a territory containing tens of millions of people, dozens of major fortified cities, a standing army of several 100,000 soldiers, and the accumulated wealth of one of the most productive agricultural civilizations then existing on Earth. The Jin also had the Great Wall running along the northern edge of their territory, a barrier which had been built and maintained over many centuries specifically to manage threats coming down from the steppe. The Mongol army crossed it without enormous difficulty, partly because the wall is considerably more impressive as a concept than as a practical military obstacle against a mobile force that can find the gaps between garrisons, and partly because some of the Jin garrison commanders along the northern frontier made the decision, under varying degrees of pressure and inducement, to simply step aside rather than resist actively. What followed over the next several years was not a single decisive campaign resolved in a single dramatic battle, but a long series of devastating raids and systematic military operations that progressively stripped the Jin of their ability to defend their own northern territories. Mongol columns moved through the countryside in multiple directions simultaneously, destroying crops, taking cities, killing or scattering garrisons that tried to make a stand. The Jin army, which was large and reasonably well equipped by the standards of the period, was outmaneuvered repeatedly by the Mongol combination of raw speed and coordinated multi-column operations across enormous distances. When the Jin forces tried to mass together for a conventional pitched battle, the Mongols would decline the engagement and simply slip away, only to reappear somewhere else entirely a few days later. When the Jin dispersed their strength to cover their many geographic vulnerabilities, they found themselves being picked apart piece by piece. One of the more significant early engagements was the Battle of Yehuling in 1211, where a large Jin force moving to intercept the Mongols was caught in a valley and effectively destroyed as a coherent fighting body. It was not a small engagement by any measure. The Jin force numbered in the hundreds of thousands by some medieval estimates, though, as with many medieval army figures, those numbers should be treated with a certain healthy caution. What is clear beyond dispute is that the battle was decisive, that the Jin lost a significant portion of their entire field army in a single afternoon of fighting, and that the Mongols suffered comparatively light casualties through a combination of their superior tactical flexibility and the brutal efficiency of the feigned retreat applied on a very large scale. The Jin emperor, facing an increasingly dire military situation, made a political decision that carried significant consequences well beyond his own immediate safety. He moved his capital southward from Zhongdu, the city that now underlies modern Beijing, all the way to Kaifeng, deep inside the Jin heartland. From a personal safety standpoint, this was a reasonable decision. From a political standpoint, it was catastrophic. The populations of the northern territories, already under enormous Mongol military pressure, interpreted the emperor's departure as outright abandonment. Jin generals in the north began defecting to the Mongols with their troops and their invaluable local knowledge intact. The entire northern military structure of the dynasty began to dissolve from within, one command at a time. Zhongdu itself fell in 1215. The city had been under intermittent siege and pressure for several years by that point, and by the time it was finally taken, its population had been reduced by famine and disease to a fraction of what it had been at the start of the campaign. The Mongols entered a city that was already halfway a ruin and completed the process methodically. Marco Polo, travelling through northern China decades later on his way to a very different Mongol court, still described vast stretches of the region in terms that made clear how severe and how lasting the destruction had been. The bones of the dead were still visible along the roads. Entire districts that had once been densely populated living communities were now empty and quiet, the wind moving through the gaps where houses had stood. The scale of population loss in northern China during the campaigns against the Jin is one of the most sobering numbers in all of medieval history, even accounting for the significant uncertainty that always attaches to medieval demographic estimates. Northern China may have lost somewhere between a third and half of its population over the course of these campaigns, to direct violence, to famine caused by agricultural disruption, and to the diseases that inevitably follow both of those things across a devastated landscape. Cities that had been among the largest urban centres in the entire world at the time were reduced to rubble and to scattered groups of survivors trying to piece something back together. It was a transformation so thorough and so deep that it reshaped the human geography of northern China for generations to come, well after the wars themselves had ended. Within all of this destruction, though, Genghis Khan was already doing something that runs slightly against the popular image of pure obliteration. He was collecting administrators. Among the most significant figures he encountered during the northern China campaigns was a man named Yel Chukai, a Khitan nobleman who had been serving the Jin court in Zhongdu when it fell. Yel Chukai was a scholar, a Confucian-trained administrator, and a man of considerable intellectual depth, who apparently had a conversation with Genghis Khan that went on long enough for each of them to develop a genuine respect for the other. Genghis Khan took him on as an advisor, and Yel Chukai would spend the rest of his career arguing, with considerable persistence and eventual effect, that the agricultural populations of conquered territories were worth substantially more alive and taxed than dead and plundered. This was not a self-evident point to everyone in the Mongol leadership, and it took years of patient argument to make it stick. But it did eventually stick, at least partially, and Yel Chukai's influence on how the empire managed its settled subjects was real and lasting, and it saved an unknown but certainly enormous number of lives across the following decades. The northern China campaigns also demonstrated something that would become a consistent pattern throughout the rest of Mongol expansion. The empire was functionally incapable of governing vast agricultural territories using only its own people. The Mongols were brilliant at conquest itself, but administration was a different skill set entirely, one that required literacy, familiarity with complex local legal and taxation systems, and the patience to manage sprawling bureaucratic structures over long periods without things falling apart. They needed people who already knew how to do these things, and they were, on balance, practical enough to use them where they found them. By the time the Jin campaigns had consumed most of the north, Genghis Khan's attention was already beginning to turn westward. The Shishir situation remained unresolved in any final sense. The Silk Road trade routes that ran through Central Asia had come to his attention through the reports of merchants and through his own intelligence network, and somewhere beyond the great mountain passes that divided Mongolia from the Islamic world, a powerful empire called the Khwarezmian ruled an enormous arc of territory stretching from Persia to the borders of India. He had not initially planned to go there at all. Events and one particularly catastrophic diplomatic decision by the Khwarezmian Shah would eventually make the choice for him. The Khwarezmian Empire in the second decade of the 13th century was one of the most powerful states anywhere in the Islamic world. It stretched from the Caspian Sea in the west across Persia, through the rich cities of Transoxiana, Samarkand, Bukhara and Urgench among them, south into Afghanistan and the edges of northern India. Its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, had spent the previous decade aggressively expanding his territory, absorbing the remnants of the Seljuk Sultanate and positioning himself as a dominant force across Central Asia. His army was large, his cities were wealthy, and by 1217 or so he had every reason to consider himself the most formidable ruler between the Mediterranean and the borders of China. Genghis Khan did not initially approach the Khwarezmian Empire as an enemy. He approached it as a potential trading partner, which is worth pausing on because it complicates the usual picture considerably. The Mongols by this point controlled enormous stretches of the overland trade routes, and the logical extension of that position was to open formal commercial relations with the states at the western end of those same routes. A large caravan, somewhere in the range of 450 merchants, and an enormous quantity of goods, including gold, silver, silk and furs, was dispatched toward Khwarezmian territory with a formal letter from Genghis Khan proposing trade and peaceful relations between the two powers. The caravan reached the Khwarezmian frontier city of Otrar, where it was met by the local governor, a man named Inalchuk, who bore the honorific title Ger Khan. What Inalchuk did next is one of those historical decisions that seems difficult to explain even under the most charitable possible interpretation of his reasoning. He accused the merchants of being spies, which some of them possibly were, since Mongol trade missions did tend to gather intelligence more or less as a matter of course, and he had the entire caravan seized and its members executed. He then kept the goods for himself. Genghis Khan responded by sending a formal diplomatic mission to Shah Muhammad, demanding justice for the massacre, specifically asking that Inalchuk be handed over to face consequences for what he had done. Shah Muhammad's response was to have the lead Mongol ambassador killed and the others sent back with their beards shaved off, which, in the cultural context of the steppe, was a profound and deliberate humiliation delivered with full understanding of exactly what it meant. It is genuinely difficult, looking back across nearly 800 years of history, to identify a diplomatic communication that achieved worse results for its sender than this one did. Muhammad had just told the ruler of the most powerful military force in the known world that he, Muhammad, was not worth the courtesy of a civil reply, and that Mongol ambassadors could be murdered and mutilated at will without consequence. The Mongols began moving west the following year. The campaign that followed, launched in 1219, was the largest military operation Genghis Khan had personally directed to that point in his life. He divided his forces into multiple columns moving on different axes simultaneously, exploiting the enormous geographic depth of the Khwarezmian Empire against itself. Shah Muhammad, who had distributed his army across dozens of separate garrisons in order to defend his many cities rather than concentrating it for a decisive field battle, found himself unable to mass any effective resistance against an enemy that could appear from unexpected directions faster than messengers could relay warnings between his own commanders. Otrar itself was surrounded and besieged. After several months of resistance, it fell. Inalchuk, the governor whose decision to massacre the trade caravan had set all of this terrible momentum in motion, was captured alive by the besieging force. He was executed in a manner that the sources describe with a specificity suggesting it was understood by everyone present to be a deliberate and public statement about what had happened. Molten silver was poured into his eyes and into his ears. It was a death calibrated with dark precision to the crime of greed that had triggered the entire war, and to the insult that had followed it when the Shah had refused to hand him over. Bukhara, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a centre of scholarship, architecture and commerce that had been producing poets, mathematicians and theologians for centuries, fell in 1220. The Mongol army entered through gates that the city's Turkish garrison had abandoned during a failed attempt at escape, leaving the civilian population to negotiate its own fate on its own terms. Genghis Khan rode into the city's great mosque, and what followed was a scene recorded in several Islamic sources, some of them nearly contemporary to the events themselves. He addressed the assembled population directly, and told them through his interpreters that their sins had brought this upon them, and that he was the punishment of God sent to them for what they had done. Whether he actually believed this in any sincere theological sense, or whether he simply understood the rhetorical utility of framing military conquest in terms that his particular audience would recognize and internalize, is not entirely clear from the record. The practical outcome was the same regardless of what he privately believed. Bukhara was stripped systematically of its wealth. Much of the city burned in the fires that followed. A population that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands was scattered across the surrounding countryside. Samarkand, the empire's showpiece city, home to enormous bazaars, elaborate gardens, and some of the finest architecture in all of Central Asia, fell not long afterward. Its garrison attempted resistance and was destroyed for the effort. The civilian population submitted and was largely spared immediate violence, though a significant portion of it was conscripted to serve as forced labour and as human shields in the subsequent siege operations against other cities further along the campaign. The city itself survived in a physical sense somewhat better than Bukhara had done, though its population and its commercial life took generations to recover to anything approaching their pre-conquest levels. Shah Muhammad himself did not stay to defend his own cities. He fled westward as the Mongol columns advanced across his territory, always somehow just barely a step ahead of the pursuit, and Genghis Khan sent two of his most capable generals, Subotai and Jebe, with a force of roughly 20,000 men to pursue him personally, with clear instructions not to return until the Shah was either dead or captured. Muhammad fled through Persia, always barely ahead of the closing pursuit, until he reached the Caspian Sea, crossed to a small island there, and died on that island of pleurisy, sick and alone, stripped of his empire, reportedly having to beg the fishermen on the island for a burial shroud because his own resources had, at long last, run out entirely. He had ruled one of the most powerful empires in the entire Islamic world, and he ended his own life as a refugee on a tiny island in the middle of the Caspian Sea, with nothing at all left to his name. It was, as historical reversals go, fairly complete in every respect. The destruction that accompanied the Khwarezmian campaign was among the most severe in the entire history of Mongol expansion, worse in many ways than what had happened in northern China. The city of Merv, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in all of Central Asia, a major centre of Islamic learning and commerce, was taken and its population massacred with a thoroughness that the medieval sources record in numbers so large that modern historians believe they must be exaggerated, while still acknowledging the underlying reality that the destruction was catastrophic beyond easy description. Nishapur was similarly devastated, partly in retaliation for the death of Genghis Khan's son-in-law during the siege there. Urgench, the Khwarezmian capital on the Oxus River, held out longest of all and was taken only after a brutal urban battle that consumed weeks of fighting. Afterward, the Mongols diverted the river itself to flood the ruins, ensuring that even the physical remnants of the city would not easily serve as a basis for rebuilding anything similar in the future. The agricultural systems of Khorasan, the intricate network of underground irrigation channels called khanats that had sustained dense human populations across an otherwise semi-arid landscape for centuries, were destroyed during the course of the campaigns, and in many cases were not repaired for generations afterward. The human and ecological impact of the Khwarezmian campaign reshaped Central Asia in ways that are still visible in the historical record of the region's population density and agricultural productivity for at least the next 2 centuries. While all of this was unfolding in the cities and farmlands of Persia and Transoxiana, Subotai and Hebei, having lost the Shah to his lonely island death, did not simply turn around and go home. With their original mission technically complete, they received permission to continue what became a reconnaissance in force through Persia into Azerbaijan and Georgia, around the southern edge of the Caucasus Mountains, and then north into the Russian steppe beyond. What followed was an 18-month sweep through territory the Mongols had never previously entered, in which they defeated a Georgian army in the field, outmaneuvered the Alan and Cuman peoples of the western steppe, and finally met a combined Russian and Cuman force at the Kalka River in 1223. The Russian princes who assembled at the Kalka River came from several different principalities, and they did not coordinate effectively with each other, or with the Cuman horsemen they were nominally fighting alongside. The battle itself was short and decisive. The Mongol force, though outnumbered, since this was a reconnaissance expedition rather than a full invasion, outfought the coalition through tactical discipline, and through the feigned retreat applied yet again, with characteristic precision. Several Russian princes who were captured after the battle were laid on the ground, covered over with wooden platforms, and the Mongol commanders ate their victory feast on top of them. It was a statement as much as it was a method of execution. Subutai and Hebei then turned east and rejoined the main army back in Central Asia. The Battle of the Kalka River was not a conquest in any real sense. The Mongols would not return to Russia in force for another decade and a half. It was in effect a warning that nobody in the Russian principalities seems to have taken quite seriously enough, while there was still time to prepare. Genghis Khan returned to the Mongolian plateau from the western campaigns in 1225, and for a brief period things settled into a relative quiet that was, by the standards of his own life, almost unfamiliar. He was somewhere in his early 60s by this point, though the exact year of his birth remains uncertain enough that historians allow themselves a few years of flexibility in either direction. He had spent the better part of 4 decades in nearly constant motion. The campaigns against the Shishia, the Jin, and then the Khwarezmian Empire had followed one another with barely a pause between them. The steppe in summer, the felt gur at night, the smell of horses and dried meat and wood smoke, these had been the constants of a life that had never really stopped moving since those years beside the Onon River as a boy. But there was one piece of unfinished business he could not leave alone. The Shishia, the Tangut kingdom that had submitted to Mongol authority years earlier and agreed to provide military support for future campaigns, had failed to send any troops when called upon during the Great Khwarezmian operation. Their king had reportedly sent back a dismissive response, suggesting that if the Mongols needed help to fight their wars, perhaps they should reconsider the wars they were starting in the first place. This was, in the political vocabulary of the Mongol Empire, an act of defiance that carried a very well-established set of consequences. Genghis Khan had made it entirely clear throughout his career that agreements were binding, and that breaking them had a specific and consistent price attached. Leaving the Tangut response unanswered would have communicated something he had no interest in communicating to anyone else who might be considering similar defiance. The final campaign against Shishia began in 1226. It was large and methodically organised, moving through Tangut territory with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterised the earlier Western campaigns. Cities fell one after another. The Tangut military resistance, which had been more resilient during earlier encounters, was overwhelmed by the sheer scale and coordination of the attack. By 1227, the Mongol forces had the Tangut capital under siege, and the kingdom's collapse was a matter of time rather than of ultimate outcome. What happened to Genghis Khan personally during this final campaign is one of those historical questions that the sources approach from several different angles and never quite resolve to universal satisfaction. The most widely accepted account holds that he suffered a significant fall from his horse during a hunt, either just before or during the campaign itself, sustaining internal injuries serious enough to affect his health for the remainder of the operation. He continued directing the campaign despite this, which was entirely consistent with how he had always managed his own physical condition, as something to be worked through rather than accommodated. A later tradition, recorded in some of the sources, suggests a more colourful cause of death involving a Tangut royal woman, a concealed weapon, and a highly inconvenient moment. But this account is almost certainly a story that attached itself to the historical record long after the events themselves, rather than any accurate description of what actually happened. History has a persistent tendency to generate interesting explanations for the deaths of important people, regardless of whether those explanations are actually true. What the sources agree on is that Genghis Khan died in August of 1227, while the Xia campaign was still in its final stages, though its outcome was no longer in any real doubt. He was somewhere in his early to mid-60s. The Tangut capital fell shortly after his death, and the Xia kingdom was dismantled with a thoroughness that went well beyond the typical terms of Mongol conquest. The ruling lineage was eliminated. The population was severely reduced through violence and displacement. The cultural and administrative structure of the entire Tangut state was in effect deliberately destroyed. Some historians have read this final act as a personal vengeance carried out by commanders who were following instructions Genghis Khan had given before his death. Others read it more simply as the inevitable conclusion of a campaign that had already been militarily decided. Either way, the Xia ceased to exist as a political entity at almost exactly the same moment their conqueror did. The body of Genghis Khan was carried back to Mongolia, and the funerary arrangements that followed were conducted with a secrecy that was, even by the operational standards of an empire quite accustomed to careful discretion, extraordinary in its lengths. The procession that carried him home reportedly killed everyone it encountered along the route: travellers, herders, anyone at all who might have seen where the body was going, and been able to describe the location afterward to anyone else. When the burial was finally complete, the site was concealed through a combination of deliberate landscape alteration and, according to some accounts, by driving herds of horses repeatedly over the ground to erase any visible trace that anyone had ever dug there. The soldiers who had completed the burial itself were then also killed, and the specific location was known thereafter only to those very few people who had reason to know and every reason in the world to keep quiet about it for the rest of their lives. The grave of Genghis Khan has never been found, despite considerable effort over the intervening centuries. Modern archaeological surveys using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and traditional excavation methods have located many things across the Mongolian landscape from that period. None of them have located him. He managed in death to achieve a degree of privacy and quiet that had entirely eluded him during his life. The question of succession had not been left entirely unresolved when he died. Genghis Khan had addressed it in his own practical and direct fashion years before the final campaign. He had 4 sons by birthday: Jochi, Chagatai, Gede, and Tolui. And the succession question was complicated from the very beginning by the persistent uncertainty surrounding Jochi's paternity, which had never been fully forgotten by anyone concerned. Jochi was the oldest of the 4 brothers, which should ordinarily have made him the natural first candidate for the succession, but Chagatai had made his feelings about Jochi's legitimacy publicly clear on more than one occasion over the years, and the tension between those 2 brothers was severe enough that having either one of them succeed risked an immediate civil war within the empire, before it had even properly consolidated itself. Gede was the compromise choice. A man known for his generous temperament, his political skill, and an ability to maintain relationships across competing factions that his brothers lacked entirely. Genghis Khan had designated him as successor at a formal family gathering years before the final campaign began. And while there was a brief period of regency under Tolui, while the great Kurultai assembled from across the enormous territory to formally confirm the choice, the transition was ultimately completed without the violent fracture that might so easily have followed instead. What Genghis Khan left behind at the moment of his death was, by any measure, genuinely staggering in its scale and reach. The empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China all the way westward across Central Asia to the edges of Persia itself. It encompassed a larger area than the Roman Empire had covered at its greatest extent, larger than the Empire of Alexander of Macedon, larger than any other political entity the world had produced up to that moment in history. It included populations speaking dozens of different languages and practicing at least 6 major religions between them. It had a functioning postal system, a written legal code, and a structure of administration that, however imperfectly, kept the whole enormous thing coordinated across distances that would have defeated most communication systems of the era completely. He had been born with nothing in a felt tent, named after a captured enemy by a father who would be dead before his 10th birthday. The clan that should have protected his family had walked away when he was still a child. He had worn a wooden collar around his neck as a prisoner before he was old enough to shave properly. The distance between that beginning and the empire he left behind at his death is one of the most extreme personal trajectories in all of recorded human history, and it was not achieved through luck or through inheritance or through any single dramatic act of will performed at some crucial moment. It was achieved through 40 years of relentless, patient, disciplined work, of building loyalty where none had previously existed, of learning from defeat as carefully as from victory, of making very hard decisions consistently and early enough to matter. His personal character, beyond the military reputation, was more nuanced than the simple portrait of a destroyer really allows. He was deeply loyal to those who had been loyal to him, men like Subutai and Jebe, and the family of Sorkhan Shira, who had helped him escape the Taichiud Kange as a boy, and whom he rewarded generously when he had the power to do so many decades later. He was genuinely curious about the world's religions, holding conversations with Buddhist monks, Taoist masters, and Islamic scholars with what appears to have been authentic interest rather than mere political performance. He maintained a consistent policy of religious tolerance within the empire that was unusual for a ruler of any era. He valued demonstrated competence above accident of birth in a way that was, for the 12th and 13th centuries, nearly revolutionary in its practical effects. He was also responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people, directly through the campaigns he ordered and indirectly through the agricultural and demographic destruction his wars left behind. These two facts are not in contradiction with each other, they simply describe the same person. The empire he had built was now in the hands of his sons, and then of their sons after them. Whether it would hold together or gradually pull itself apart was a question that had no certain answer in 1227. For the moment it held, and for the moment that alone was extraordinary enough. Gede Khan, once he was formally confirmed on the throne at the Kurultai in 1229, was not his father, and he did not really try to be. Where Genghis Khan had been a man of personal physical toughness, relentless focus, and a certain austere quality in his leadership style, Gede was sociable, generous almost to a fault, and possessed of an enthusiasm for wine that those around him found charming right up until the point where it became a genuine medical concern. He hosted feasts that lasted for days on end. He gave gifts with an open-handedness that occasionally alarmed his own administrators. He was, by multiple accounts, genuinely well liked by the people who served him, which was itself a significant governing asset in an empire that depended so heavily on the personal loyalty of dozens of powerful regional commanders scattered across enormous distances. One of Gede's first and most significant decisions was to build a permanent capital city for the empire. The Mongols had always governed from the saddle, from moving camps and seasonal stopping points, and while this had worked well enough for a steppe confederation, it was increasingly inadequate for an empire that now needed to receive ambassadors from foreign courts, process taxation from settled populations, store administrative records, and coordinate operations across a territory stretching from the Pacific to Persia. The city of Karakorum in central Mongolia was developed into a proper imperial capital, built largely by craftsmen and engineers brought in from conquered territories, containing workshops, temples, mosques, churches, and the great palace of Gede himself. It was not a large city by the standards of the places the Mongols had conquered. A later Venetian visitor would note, with diplomatic honesty, that the city was considerably less impressive than the village of Saint-Denis outside Paris. But it was a capital in the functional sense that mattered, a fixed point around which the administrative life of the empire could organize itself. The unfinished campaign against the Jin dynasty was completed under Gede's direction, closing the account that his father had opened. The last Jin emperor died in 1234, reportedly by his own hand, as the final city of resistance fell around him. The Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China for over a century, ceased to exist entirely. Gede then turned his attention west. A great western campaign was planned, commanded nominally by Batu Khan, Jochi's son and now the senior representative of that line, with the aging Subutai serving as the operational mastermind behind the whole enormous enterprise. The force that assembled for this campaign in 1236 was large, well supplied, and led by some of the most experienced commanders the entire Mongol system had produced across 3 decades of expansion. The Volga Bulgars were overrun efficiently. Then the columns turned toward the Russian principalities. The city of Ryazan was taken and destroyed in December of 1237. Vladimir, Suzdal, and a long string of other cities followed in quick succession through the brutal winter that followed. The Mongols operated with terrifying effectiveness in deep winter conditions that would have completely stopped most other armies of the period. Frozen rivers served as highways for their cavalry. The cold that immobilized defenders behind their city walls simply did not immobilize the Mongol army in the same way. Kiev, one of the oldest and most important cities in the entire Slavic world, a centre of Orthodox Christianity and a city of genuine architectural beauty, was besieged and taken in December of 1240. The destruction there was severe. A Franciscan friar named Giovanni de Plano Carpini, who travelled through the region several years later on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court, described passing through the landscape around Kiev and seeing skulls and bones covering the ground across a vast area. The remnants of a population that had once been enormous and was now almost entirely gone. From the Russian steppe, the campaign divided into 2 columns. One pushed northwest into Poland, the other drove southwest into Hungary itself. The Polish column encountered a combined force of Polish knights, Teutonic knights, and other German military orders at a place called Legnica in April of 1241. The battle lasted less than a single day. The European force was destroyed. A relief force from Bohemia, riding hard to arrive in time, reached the battlefield a full 2 days after the fighting had already finished. Hungary was the primary strategic target of the whole Western campaign. King Blar IV assembled a substantial army and marched east to meet the advance at the Mohi crossing on the Sage River. The Battle of Mohi, fought in April of 1241, on more or less the same day as Legnica far to the north, was a comprehensive Mongol victory of exactly the classical pattern. The Hungarian army was encircled, then deliberately offered a small gap in the encirclement, and as soldiers poured through what they took to be an escape route, they were cut down in a long-running pursuit across open ground. Blar survived by fleeing to the Adriatic coast and eventually to an island for safety. The Mongol advance overran Hungary and reached the Adriatic Sea itself by the end of 1241. Western Europe now lay entirely open ahead of them. The Holy Roman Empire had received frantic letters from Batu warning of exactly what was coming. There was no coordinated response that amounted to anything effective, and then Gede Khan died in December of 1241 in Karakorum, an entire continent away from the campaign his commanders were in the process of winning decisively. The cause was almost certainly his long-running enthusiasm for wine, which his personal physicians had been attempting to moderate for years with only limited success. The senior Mongol commanders in Europe, including Batu and Subutai, were required by law and by long-standing custom to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would determine the next great Khan. The campaign stopped. The army withdrew from Hungary and Poland. Europe, which had been watching the eastern horizon with what can only be described as genuine existential dread, found that the storm had simply passed without anyone in the West having done very much to stop it. The Mongols simply left. They would never return in comparable force. It is one of history's more remarkable accidents that the entire shape of medieval Europe was determined in significant part by the drinking habits of a man in Mongolia whom almost nobody in Europe had ever heard of during his lifetime. The period that historians have come to call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was not peaceful in any absolute sense of the word. Wars continued at the edges of the empire. Internal tensions between the various khanates simmered constantly, but for the movement of goods, people and ideas across the vast middle band of Eurasia, from China all the way to the Black Sea, there was, for roughly a century beginning in the middle of the 1200s, a degree of stability and safety along the trade routes that the ancient world had rarely if ever experienced simultaneously across such enormous distance. A merchant carrying the paisa, the tablet of authority issued by the Mongol administration, travelled under the empire's direct protection across every territory it controlled. Local rulers who interfered with authorized merchants or their goods faced consequences that were enforced consistently enough to make the risk genuinely deterrent to almost anyone who might have been tempted to try. The roads and relay stations of the Yam system, originally built for military communication between commanders, were now made available to diplomatic and commercial travellers as well. Fresh horses waited at regular intervals along every major route. Caravanserais, rest stations offering food, shelter and fodder, were maintained along the length of the main corridors. A journey from the Black Sea ports all the way to China, which would previously have required navigating a complex patchwork of competing and often actively hostile political systems, could now be accomplished under a single administrative umbrella for most of its length. Chinese silk and porcelain flowed westward in quantities that transformed consumer culture among the wealthy classes of Persia, the Levant, and eventually Europe itself. Cotton, textiles and spices moved from South Asia into the steppe and beyond. Glassware and metalwork from Islamic craftsmen travelled east into China. Furs from the northern forests moved in multiple directions at once. But alongside all the physical merchandise moved something considerably harder to weigh and much easier to underestimate: techniques, ideas and whole knowledge systems that crossed the Eurasian landmass and quietly changed what people on both ends actually knew how to do. Paper money, which the Chinese had been using in various forms since the Song dynasty, was encountered by Western travellers within the Mongol domains with a mixture of fascination and deep suspicion. Printing technology, which made paper money and mass-written records possible at scale, began moving westward through the networks the Mongol Empire had created, arriving in Europe through multiple intermediary channels over the following century. Gunpowder, which Chinese engineers had been using in military applications for some time before the Mongol expansion began, spread more rapidly into the Islamic world and eventually into Europe during this same period. The magnetic compass, which made open ocean navigation considerably more reliable, followed similar channels westward. None of these transfers happened in any single dramatic moment of cultural exchange. They happened the way most technological diffusion has always happened, gradually through a long chain of practical people solving practical problems with the best tools available to them, and not always fully aware of where those tools had originally come from in the first place. Kublai Khan was Genghis Khan's grandson, the fourth son of Tolui, and from very early in his life he showed an orientation toward the settled, literate world of China that set him apart from most of his family. While his cousins and uncles maintained the traditional steppe ways with varying degrees of conviction, Kublai spent his formative years in close contact with Chinese scholars, administrators, and Buddhist teachers. He learned to read Chinese, an unusual accomplishment for a Mongol prince of his generation. He employed Chinese advisors in the management of his personal domains in northern China, and he demonstrated a genuine interest in how agricultural civilizations actually functioned from the inside. Munka Khan, who had become Great Khan in 1251 after a turbulent succession, sent Kublai southward to press the campaign against the southern Song dynasty, the Chinese state below the Huai River that had survived the earlier destruction of the Jin. Then Munki died in 1259 during that campaign, probably of dysentery, and everything reorganized itself around the question of who came next. Kublai moved quickly, holding his own Kurultai in northern China and declaring himself Great Khan before the situation could solidify against him. The civil war that followed with his younger brother Arik Biki lasted 4 years and ended in 1264 when Arik Biki submitted. Kublai controlled the east, and the east was where he now intended to build something entirely new. The conquest of the southern Song dynasty proved to be the longest, most technically demanding, and in many ways most costly campaign the Mongol military ever undertook anywhere. The Song had over 60 million subjects, a sophisticated administrative system, and a military that had spent decades specifically adapting to resist Mongol tactics. They also possessed the Yangtze River and the waterways of southern China, which posed exactly the kind of obstacle that had always given the Mongol army serious trouble in the past. The final act came in 1279 at a naval battle near modern Guangzhou, where the last Song fleet was cornered and destroyed. A loyalist official named Lu Shufu, understanding that capture was the only alternative, took the young emperor, a child of 7, in his arms and jumped into the sea together with him. The southern Song dynasty ended in the water, carrying its last emperor down with it. Kublai Khan was now the ruler of all China, the first non-Chinese emperor ever to achieve this. He established a new dynasty, the Yuan, with its capital at a rebuilt and greatly expanded city on the site of the old Jin capital, which he called Khanbalik, meaning City of the Khan, the city that now underlies modern Beijing. It was into this court, glittering and cosmopolitan and operating on a scale that had no real equivalent anywhere in the Western world of the time, that Marco Polo arrived, according to his own account, in approximately 1275. He had travelled overland from Venice with his father and uncle, and he would remain in the orbit of the Yuan court for roughly 17 years before eventually returning to Europe. His account of what he saw, dictated to a fellow prisoner after his return and subsequent capture during a Venetian and Genoese naval conflict, became one of the most widely read and widely doubted travel narratives in the entire history of European literature. He was known informally in Venice for some years after his return as Marco Millions, on account of his habit of describing everything in his account in very large numbers. It is worth noting that the large numbers were by and large accurate. The Mongol Empire did not end cleanly, and it did not fall in a single dramatic moment. It faded khanate by khanate across the course of a century and a half, with different regions detaching themselves at different speeds and leaving behind different kinds of residue in the process. In China, the combination of plague, flooding, famine, and the accumulated resentments of Yuan misrule produced the conditions for large-scale rebellion in the 1350s and 1360s. From within a movement drawing on Buddhist millenarianism and genuine popular grievance, emerged a man named Zhu Yuanzhong, the orphaned son of a tenant farmer who had survived the plague and famine of the 1340s by begging and by spending time in a Buddhist monastery, who proved to be one of the most capable military and political organizers of the entire period. He built a coalition, defeated his rivals within the rebel movement, and turned his combined force against the Yuan court in the north. The last Yuan emperor, Tohon Tenma, fled Beijing in 1368 as Zhu Yuanzhang's forces approached, not in a final dramatic last stand, but in a pragmatic withdrawal northward toward Mongolia, which was where the Mongols had originally come from all those generations earlier. The Yuan dynasty was over. The Ming dynasty, one of the most stable and longest-lasting in all of Chinese history, had begun, founded by the farmer's son who had somehow survived everything the late Mongol period had inflicted on the Chinese countryside. The disease that Europeans would eventually come to call the Black Death appears to have originated somewhere in the Central Asian steppe environment, possibly in the region around the northern shore of the Caspian Sea, in the 1330s. The Mongol trade routes that had done so much to connect Eurasia commercially also provided exactly the kind of infrastructure that a contagious disease needed to move efficiently across vast distances. Regular movement of people and goods along established corridors, relay stations where travellers stopped and interacted, and a network dense enough to carry infection from its point of origin to both ends of the continent within a relatively short period of time. Europe lost somewhere between a third and half of its population over the following decade. The Islamic world was similarly devastated. China, which had already experienced earlier outbreaks of what may have been the same disease during the Mongol period itself, also suffered enormous losses of its own. The Mongol trade network had not created the plague. It had always been there somewhere in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe. But the network had given it a highway, and the highway had connected every major civilization in Eurasia to the same catastrophe simultaneously. The genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire was documented in a study published in 2003, which found that roughly 8% of the men living today across the broad region of the former Mongol Empire, approximately 16 million people in total, share a particular Y chromosome pattern that appears to have originated in a single individual living roughly 1,000 years ago somewhere in Mongolia. The pattern's distribution maps closely onto the exact territories the Mongols once controlled, with concentrations particularly high across Central Asia. The most likely candidate for the original carrier of this genetic pattern is Genghis Khan himself, or a close male relative of his. Genghis Khan built the largest empire in history, and may also, by one measure, be the most biologically influential single human being who ever lived. Both facts are real, and taken together they produce a portrait of a life whose sheer scale is almost impossible to hold in the mind at the same time. The memory of the Mongols varies enormously depending on where you happen to be standing when you encounter it. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan is the founding national hero, his face appearing on the currency, his name attached to airports. Vodka brands, government buildings, and the entire national narrative of the country. In Iran, Iraq, and parts of Central Asia, the Mongol conquest is remembered instead as a catastrophe, the destruction of cities, the collapse of agricultural systems, the deaths of tens of millions of people, and the memory is not heroic in any sense. In China, the Mongol period occupies a complicated space in the national historical narrative, acknowledged as one dynastic era among many, but not particularly celebrated. In Russia, the Mongol period, sometimes called the Tatar yoke, has served for centuries as a cultural reference point for external oppression and interrupted development, both real and imagined. All of these memories contain within them genuine truth and genuine distortion, in proportions that shift depending on which community is doing the remembering and for what particular purpose. The Mongol Empire was simultaneously the instrument of some of the most severe demographic catastrophes in pre-modern history, and the creator of the most extensive connected trade and communication network the ancient and medieval world had ever produced. It destroyed cities and preserved others, it killed scholars and employed them, it spread the Black Death along its trade routes, and it spread printing technology along those same routes. The moral balance sheet does not resolve cleanly, and the historians who have tried over the years to make it resolve, either by emphasizing the destruction or by emphasizing the connectivity, have generally had to leave something important out in order to make their argument actually hold together. What the Mongol Empire ultimately demonstrates, above everything else, is the scale of what a single human life can set in motion when it operates at the intersection of personal capacity, historical circumstance, and the willingness to remake the world's assumptions about what is actually possible. A boy born in a felt tent on the Mongolian steppe, abandoned by his own clan, forced to survive on fish and marmots, imprisoned in a wooden collar before he was old enough to shave. That boy built something that connected China to Europe, that moved technology and disease and trade and ideas across the entire width of the Eurasian continent, that shaped the borders, political cultures, and genetic makeup of populations numbering in the hundreds of millions of people. The storm that was the Mongol Empire passed, but the landscape it moved through was never quite the same shape again afterward, and that, in the long run, is what history mostly turns out to be. Not the great events themselves, but the changed world they leave behind, still carrying the marks of the wind long after the wind itself has finally gone. If you are still awake at this point, and it would be entirely understandable if you are not, there is another quiet story waiting for you on the screen, ready to carry you a little further into the past. If this one brought you something worth carrying, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left in the comments below would mean more than you know. But for now, let your body go heavy. Let the steppe grass settle. The horses have stopped. The great Khan has returned to the earth. There is nothing left tonight but the quiet. Close your eyes. Rest well. Peace.